recording?
Yep, it's recording.
Thank you. Okay, so for those of you who were here last week, yeah, you would have heard me say some of this already. And the seminar series that we've organized is based on a 2-year project which was funded by the British Academy. And this project sought to bring together a group of international scholars from different disciplines to explore the politics of children's rights and representation. And specifically, we sought to explore together questions relating to who represents children and their rights, the role of children themselves in claims of representation, and what exactly constitutes the claims that the various actors involved make, the agendas behind the claims, and the basis, both implicit and explicit, upon which these claims are made. And we developed a set of questions together as a group, and we use these questions to return to the various bits of research we've been doing over the years in different contexts in the global north and in the global south, and also within international organizations, to examine how the politics of children's representation manifested itself in the environments that we've been working with. And our focus was both historical and also contemporary. And over the last 2 years, we have shared our work with each other. We produced 7 papers as a result of the project. And we've shared our papers with each other in the UK, in Sheffield, and in Ghana. And we've really, that feedback we got from each other was really helpful in strengthening our analysis and producing our papers. And today, what we want to do, or with the series that we've put together, we want to share the work we've been doing and engage in a dialogue with a broader audience consisting of both academics and non-academics. Like I said last week, the structure for the 2 seminars that we are organizing will comprise a presentation by one of the project members. So we have 3 presentations in total. And this will then be followed by a short response from a discussant. And one of the things I want to emphasize today is that one of the key goals behind our work was that we wanted to engage with those in the non-academic sector about the research we've been doing and to elicit their feedback. And we did this a bit when we met in Ghana in January 2020, when we invited 2 academics and 2 non-academics to join us for our 3-day workshop and to share their thoughts on our work. And it's because of this importance of engaging with those within the non-academic sector that we've organized our seminar in this way, with not just the 3 academic presenters who were involved in the project, but also discussants who are all from the non-academic sector today. And we look forward to hearing their insights and also their questions about our papers. Following the 3 presentations and the responses by the discussants, we will then open the floor for a broader discussion. Do feel free to put your questions in the chat as we go along, or at the time for discussion. If you raise your hand, we will let you know when you can unmute yourself and ask a question or make your comment. Please do ensure that while the presentations are ongoing, that you keep yourself on mute. So the full profile of that's not true. We don't have the full profile of all the discussants today, but you have a full profile of the presenters, which is online. And but I will just briefly do an introduction. So for our first paper today, we're going to do in a slightly different order from what you've seen online. We're going to start with Didier Reynaert, who's a lecturer in social work and a senior researcher at the Equality or Research Collective of Huygens University of Applied Sciences and Arts in Belgium. The topic of his paper is Children's Rights and Child Poverty, Reflections through the Lens of Representation. And joining him to discuss his paper is Rudy de Kock, who's the policy officer mainly working on poverty at the Child and Family Agency in Flanders, also in Belgium. His paper will then be followed by a presentation by Jonathan Josephson, who is an associate senior lecturer at the Department of Child Studies in Linköping in Sweden. And the topic of this paper is Children and Youth Strategies for Self-Representation, Young Migrants in Sweden. And joining him in his discussion is Sanna Westin, who has been active in grassroots movements, mostly on solidarity, anti-racism, and refugee issues for over 30 years in Sweden also. And finally, we have a paper by Professor Yao Ofosukwusi, who's a professor of social studies, and he's currently the Dean of the School of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Energy and Natural Resources in Sunyani, Ghana. The topic of his presentation is Deliberate Disobedience as a Strategy for Representation by Accra's Street Children. And joining him, hopefully, is George Afum-Ansah, who's the Deputy Director of the Catholic Action for Street Children. Okay, so that is the plan for today. So without any further ado, we will start with our first presentation by Didier. Thank you, Didier.
Thanks a lot, Afua. Can you hear me, just to be sure?
Yes, we can. Yes.
All right, thank you. Thanks a lot, Afua, for the introduction, and also thanks a lot to you and also to Edward to organize this series of seminars where we have the opportunity to present our findings, as you explained. I will share a short presentation with you, just a few slides that will help me in telling the issues I want to raise here today. Normally, you can see my slides now. Okay, here we go. So as Afua is saying, my topic is on child poverty, and I will look at the relationship between child poverty and children's rights from the lens of representation. Very quickly, as a starting point for my short presentation, some words about the issue, the problem of child poverty. As you all might know, it is indeed a big problem. It has become a big problem past decades. The children living and growing up in a situation of poverty has been increasing the past decades, mainly part due to the global economic crisis of 2008, but also recently, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic is not really helpful in tackling this issue of child poverty. On the contrary, numbers from several organizations state that the number of children living in poverty because of COVID-19 will increase by 15%, and probably the worst is yet to come. What we see, for instance, in Belgium, and we see it in a lot of other countries, that since 2008, since the global economic crisis, the number of children living in poverty has doubled from 5–6% of children to today 12 to 15, depending on the indicator you use. So we have a big problem here. And what should maybe worry us most maybe is that despite the fact that it's increasing every year, we try to do something about it. There are investments, there is a policy, there are policy plans, a lot of measures are setting up to combat child poverty. Nevertheless, the numbers are increasing year after year after year. There is a bit of good news, you could say, from a children's rights lens. The good news is that there is some kind of a common sense that the framework of children's rights is considered as an important framework, an important instrument to combat child poverty. Child poverty is then seen as a violation of, let's say, every right of children that is included in the conventional rights of the child. So that gives us a very strong instrument to do something about child poverty. You could say, well, that's good news because it's a way of mobilizing financial means, a way of mobilizing efforts, and so on. At the same time, I think, and that will be the starting point of my of the discourse I want to tell here today. At the same time, I think this this common sense on children's rights as an instrument to combat child poverty is also a problem. I agree with Walter van den Hole, which is a colleague here in Antwerp, a legal scholar at University of Antwerp, who is saying that, well, the link between child poverty and children's rights, it's actually an uneasy fit. there is poverty. On their website, they show some numbers about the issue of child poverty. And they also refer or state that children should be put first. And I think exactly there is the uneasy fit when children should be put first when combating child poverty. And also the name child poverty says it all. We are talking about children living in poverty. We are not talking about families living in poverty. We're not talking about the parents living here in poverty. And of course, there is the uneasy fit. And that's something I want to very briefly want to further explore today. In terms of representation, what we see then when we look at children living in poverty, we see a different representation of children compared to parents living in poverty. What do we see? Well, we see that children are considered as the victims of poverty. They are not considered as bearing any responsibility whatsoever for their poverty situation. They are a victim, and that's why they are considered as a deserving poor, deserving in the sense that they deserve support. They deserve material support, psychosocial support, because it's not their fault they are living in poverty. And it's quite different from the perspectives of or the way parents are represented in poverty. Parents in poverty are considered as responsible for their own situation. They are considered as responsible also for the poverty situation of their children. So they are considered as the undeserving poor. They are represented as the undeserving poor. They don't deserve any support because it's their own fault that they are in the situation that they are today. Therefore, they are often considered also as the bad parents. In terms of policy and policy framework that is set up, of course, for children, because they are represented as the victim, there is a lot of structures in place. There is extra support for children in poverty in education, for instance, in leisure time, in the context of child allowances. So there is quite a lot of support, financial support and other kind of support for children living in poverty. And it's very different from also here again from the parents living in poverty. If you look at policy measures in general, policy measures for parents, well, they are quite controlling. That's also what Ruth Lister is referring to in her analysis, in her research. Measures towards parents in poverty are often very controlling and focusing on activating parents. While for children, there is common sense. We should invest in childcare, in education. So in all these domains that I consider as a childhood moratorium, all these domains that are focusing exclusively on children. That's where we invest in. Of course, then I argue that children in poverty are represented differently than their parents living in poverty when making claims for social justice. And I could continue my statement in saying, and that is a problem. I could even continue my statements also adding that also from the lens of children's rights, this is happening. I will come back to that point within a few minutes. This was the starting point of our analysis, that we saw that in scholarly work, but also in practice, in policy, there is a different representation of children in poverty than parents in poverty. We did research in Flanders on families living in poverty, and therefore we interviewed parents. There is a lot of things to say, I guess, about representational issues in terms of doing interview with parents to learn something about child poverty, but that's what we did. We interviewed a lot of parents living in poverty on child poverty. And what we saw then in these narratives of these parents, that there is a complex interplay between life domains of children, which are embedded in this childhood moratorium, these structures exclusively focusing on children on the one hand, and the life domains of adults outside this childhood moratorium. And let me come back to the first quote here of a mother saying that, well, of course, my children, they have a lot of friends, but these friends, they don't come to our home because we have bad housing conditions and our house is too small. There is no place to play. we have one bedroom for 3 children. So sometimes my children, they go playing with other children, but I always tell my children, don't ask your friends to come and play at home. What this quote is referring at is that, for instance, the policy domain of housing, which is often not linked to the situation of children in poverty, but it's linked to parents in poverty, is not taken into account in policies for combating child poverty. Because, of course, policies for combating child poverty are embedded in this youth moratorium. You are focusing on education, on childcare, and so on, not on housing. Housing is for the parents. The parents are responsible for making sure that children can grow up in good housing conditions.
You have 3 minutes left.
Thanks a lot. Okay, this is going very fast. So what I'm trying to show here is even the domains are linked to parents have a great impact also on children. What we also saw is that parents do everything to provide their children the necessary conditions to grow up, even to the disadvantage of their own posits. That's what also a mother was saying, that she has 2 children, but she don't have the money to pay an apartment for bedrooms for all of them. So she needs 3 bedrooms, one for the children, for the 2 children, and one for her own. But she can afford it. So what she did is she rented an apartment with 2 bedrooms, one for each of the children, and she slept in the couch for years. So there you see these solidarity mechanisms that exist within families. They are very complex. And we should be aware that poor children are always children of poor parents. You can't cut these interests away from each other. And I conclude with this slide, coming back to children's rights and representational issues, because you can say, well, of course it did. That's evident what you are telling us. The thing is, if I look at what children's rights organizations are doing, it's not that evident. I end with a very small example from the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which is not just an organization. I think the Committee on the Rights of the Child, it's fair to say that it's maybe the most important international organization with a high moral standard on children's rights. And a couple of years ago, I think it was in 2012 or so, there was the concluding observations to Belgium, and the committee was stating an issue on begging children. And in the concluding observation, it was written that there is a problem in the big cities in Belgium about children who are begging on the streets, which is a violation of their rights, because of course children should be in school because they have the right to education. That's what the committee was saying, and I think no one would disagree with what the committee was stating here. But my point is not about what the committee was saying. What I want to make clear is what the committee was not saying. Not one word on the parents living on the street with their children. And that's exactly the point I want to make here. The way we represent children and parents in the case of child poverty is very different. And the danger is that we focus only on children. I think the committee missed a chance here also to raise an issue in relation to the parents living in poverty on the streets. And there's exactly the problem here with the discourse on child poverty, also made up by children's rights organizations. If we cut off these 2 interests from each other, then we create problems also in trying to realize children's rights for children in poverty. I end up here. Thanks a lot for listening to my very short presentation.
Thank you, Didier. So we go straight to Rudy for your response to Didier's presentation.
Thank you. I would like to say that I'm very grateful to Didier and his colleagues for the contribution they wrote. It gives language and insight into an issue that I myself deal with on a daily basis when it comes to policy development in the fight against poverty. It's in a clear and a rich way. The effects of a one-sided approach from the perspective of children's rights to poverty and social exclusion are outlined, not from the nuanced and coherent narrative within the convention, but from a more obvious approach, namely for the best interest of the child. An approach that lives strongly in Flanders still, and is quite dominant. It defines a lot of practices. So the contribution makes it clear that the effects of this approach are not so positive, as an understatement, neither for the children nor for the parents. And it makes also possible to think critically about the policies pursued and the practices set up from that obvious approach. And I would like to illustrate this on the basis of two current examples. I to try to change to share my share. I hope you see it. Okay.
Yes, we can.
Okay. So the first example can be found in the annual report of the foster care organization in Flanders, and it says that they record some data on families, but it's not always done systematically. So it only gives an indication of possible reasons why foster care is used. And the annual report states that many families that require foster care have a difficult living situation. This is caused, for example, by financial difficulties, poor housing, or a bad health situation. And what we see in this annual report, they write there may be a lack of income, which means that care for children no longer can be met. So it means that foster care, and we'll go to the next one, is used when the income situation of parents is critical. And here you see that for about, we know, or foster care knows about, for about 63% of the families with children in foster care, the income situation is known. And what we see is that about 40% of those families has no income, and 35% have a replacement income. 8% and about 20% has a rather precarious income. So it means that of the group within foster care, about 68% of the parents' families are living in a condition with a very precarious income situation. So the answer to the question on what, so I asked them the answer to the question on what is being done by foster care organizations with this determination was quite sobering. In fact, they didn't do anything with it. So the question arises, if we agree that children are taken into foster care due to the income situation of their parents, and if foster care is there for a temporary reason, how children can return to their families if work is not done on the course of the placement. So it's a rather annoying observation. And the second one is on family coaches. It's a relatively new development within family support. And what you see is a newspaper article from yesterday. And the project call dates from last Friday. So it's quite fresh. And by putting them aside, I think the first one shows very well what happens when a family coach is introduced to encourage parents to set a good example. So it seems to me that parents here are branded as not so good parents. The second one is launched by our departments, not our agency, but the departments of which our agency is part. And there is a two-sided approach. It's not only about children and parents, it's about families. It's about children who are struggling with questions and needs in multiple areas of life at the same time.
You have 3 minutes left.
Thank you. Enabling, in order to enable them to achieve more fundamental social rights. I'm giving them because it shows that the tension that Didier describes in his work really exists in the here and now. So I think that the contribution of Didier and his colleagues contains the basis for a strong counter-narrative to the one-sided and narrowed approach of children's rights when it comes to fighting poverty. And I think it's also a call for action. I would like to mention some numbers of elements I think we should take into that counter-narrative. So the first one is, let us embrace the tension between children's rights and human rights in the fight against poverty and social exclusion, and let us take both into account. So we shouldn't put children first. We should put, I think, families first. Children, youngsters, families living in poverty aren't victims, but strong actors trying to change their situation and to have control on their life. A broad and holistic shared vision on poverty and social exclusion as a result of institutional and societal organization can be helpful. I think it's important to make poverty and social exclusion visible. And I mean by that we should have facts and figures on poverty, and that we should know those families to work with. Participation is not only a right, but a necessity for subsequent policy and practice. It's about giving a voice to children and parents. And last one is work together towards more integrated services for families, children, and youngsters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rudy. Okay, so we move on straight to our second paper by Jonathan, which we followed by a response from Sana. So Jonathan, when you're ready.
Thank you. So I'm very happy to be here today. My talk is based also on a research project funded by the Swedish Research Council on youth migrant and anti-deportation campaigns. This is part of another project as well. Okay. So in late summer 2017, a group of young Afghan migrants started a sit-in strike outside the Swedish parliament in Stockholm to stop all the deportations to Afghanistan. So in a few days, the group grew to a couple of hundred protesters and readied considerable attention in leading newspapers and social media. The protest in front of the Swedish parliament became the start of a contentious struggle in streets, outside detention centers, at airports, and in social media to impel the Swedish government to stop the deportations to Afghanistan. So at an early stage, the group that called themselves Ung i Sverige, or Young in Sweden, made clear that the protest was arranged by themselves and that they did not want to be represented by others. So they claimed a voice of their own vis-a-vis the Swedish government and society, independent from NGOs, networks of professionals, guardians, or state agencies that traditionally had been representing them on these issues before. As a context, this protest took place in the wake of an increasing number of asylum seekers a few years before, in 2015 and 2016, to Sweden and Europe, as you probably know of. So when the Swedish government, like other European governments, had taken a range of extraordinary measures to restrict the number of asylum seekers and applicants and their opportunities to be granted residence permits. So at the time of the protest, this restrictive immigration regime had started to be put into force. And now this group of about 30 to 35,000 young unaccompanied minors mainly from Afghanistan started to get their rejections of their asylum applications. However, I also want to point here and note that migration is not the only area, even though that is the topic for today, where children have mobilized lately, children and youth have mobilized lately. This kind of mass mobilization that the sit-in strike that I will talk about today and their strategies is not the only one. So we have seen this kind of struggles globally on issues such as climate change, democracy, racism, labor, against police violence, or for peace and security. And it has rendered also considerable attention in public debate and research lately. And this growing unease among young people, it has been a way of contesting contemporary ways of political representation. But yet I would say that, and I would suggest in this paper, that we still have kind of a scant empirical and theoretical knowledge about these kind of strategies that are used by children and youth in their claim for political self-representation, and how these are shaped by institutional, societal, cultural contexts, and what the political effects of them are, and also how we theoretically can make sense of these. So therefore, I will now explore particularly the kind of particular strategies of self-representation that these young migrants were using during their sit-in strike, in a way to get more knowledge about kind of context and the kind of environment that these kind of new forms of political representations take place. And Sweden is not unique when it comes to anti-deportation campaigns or protests. We have similar cases in the US, in Canada, in Australia, in the UK, and so on, in Germany, where one have used different kind of political repertoires or contentious actions, such as hunger strikes, marches, petitions, social media mobilization, petitions, and so on. So this is a very quick overview from my draft paper that will be presented in this forthcoming volume. The four strategies I will present here are the strategy of rejecting previous forms of representation, the strategy of establish, shape, and control political identity, the strategy of creating new political space, and the strategy of making opponents and allies. Rejecting previous forms of representation. So the first strategy I would like to present is to establish a politics of self-representation, is to refuse or oppose previous forms of representation. Historically, also in other areas, the reactions of the ways in which children and youth are politically represented by those in power have been a recurrent first step to create new political space and pave the way for new political action and agendas. So for this group of young migrants from Afghanistan, the refusal to be represented by others was, as some of the organizers described it, essential to establish a direct link to Swedish society, and also to counter dominant discourses around young Afghans that have been in circulation for some time. So evidently, the forms of representation by NGOs, legal representatives, governmental officials, professional organizations, or child ombudspersons had not been sufficient, according to this group. And one we're now seeking new forms of political self-representation. And the distancing from other organizations seemed at the time necessary then to create this kind of room for new political maneuvering, and also to take control in some way also over the identity of the group and how it was communicated to the Swedish society and public. Also, this kind of distancing had an internal function as well, as a way to create distance from a kind of bureaucratic and big organizations, as well as older Afghanistans that were involved in this and trying to affect this. And it was also a way to try to demonstrate the proximity to the group members. So by creating a distance and trying to create an identity and rejecting previous forms, it was a way also to create this kind of authority within the group and credibility and legitimacy in the group. So a second strategy is the one who to establish, shape, and control new identities. If the rejecting of previous forms of representation, as described above, is essential first step to open up political space. In addition, this strategy, namely to shaping and controlling of group identity, serves, I would suggest, as a key mechanism to fill this space with representative claims and content. So this kind of staging of new actors or subjectivities, as in the proclamation of the phrase of the group, "We are young in Sweden," and so they declared also what they stand for, who they were, and so on. This was a way to appear before the public, to use to rephrase or paraphrase Hannah Arendt's use of appearing for the public as a group, which in turn then I argue also can recast kind of features or defining features of how to represent the group. So this kind of appearance is then key, and trying to get established and shape and control of this new identity. And this is, and as I told, and as I said before, migration is not the only context in which this kind of control of identity and establish is really key. So you see it also in the climate mobilization, for example, like climate strikes. See it in children's labor movement and so on, and against police violence. So it's a frequent pattern, I would suggest. But also this kind of public appearance, important to note, is that this kind of, or what I would call a regrouping, do not come without contestations. And it is in constant need of negotiations, reformulations, and defense in relation to other actors. And not least since the notions of childhoods in many contexts have been one of protection and a group in need of particular protection, as we also heard in the talk by Didier before here. So a third strategy here of self-representation is also to create political space from which one can act and raise claims of representation. So this would then be a space in a physical, but also in a virtual and symbolic sense, from which one can hold other actors accountable, recast dynamics of who is an authoritative representative, and also position oneself to these other actors. So one needs a political space to be able to act upon or from as a kind of platform. So in order to do this, a rich catalog of protest repertoires have been used historically, and also by this group. It could be like, using school spaces, streets, official buildings, neighborhood, parliaments, commercial buildings, news reporting, and social media. These are just some of the examples here, from which one can make representative claims, and which also underline the centrality of spatial dimensions for the crafting of new political representations. And not to forget this spatial dimension, which is sometimes downplayed when, in some discussions, I would say. So for Young in Sweden, the struggle over space became essential for the resistance against deportations. So as the protests moved—
You have 3 minutes left.
Thank you, Afua. As the protests moved between central public spaces and places outside Stockholm, the parliament, outside detention centers, airports, schools, as well as into news reporting and social media, these kind of sites of resistance became very central to build a platform from which the group could take action. A fourth strategy of self-representation is about navigating the political landscape by approaching opponents and allies. So this kind of strategy that we encounter in various political strategies of children and youth around the world. Central to this strategy is to position oneself against opponents that uphold oppressing powers and unjust political orders, or that pose perhaps a direct threat to the existence of the movement itself. At the same time, this approaching of opponents and allies is a possibility also to create links of solidarity and building alliances with other parts outside in society around them. And that seems just as important as well. So this enemy and friend distinction, the kind of agonistic nature of politics, has obviously been a prominent view of what constitutes the political in modern political theory. Yet in the sphere of childhood, it has been not so prominent, I would say, since other ways of conceptualizing political representation have been more prominent. I go to the conclusion here. So in this presentation, I have then suggested 4 different strategies that constitute a politics of self-representation for children and youth. It has been rejecting previous forms of representation, establishing and shape and control political identity, to create new political space, and the making of opponents and allies. And the examination of these strategies recasts the logics of where, when, and how political authorization and accountability take. 2 key concepts that are very central to how we normally conceptualize political representation. We give an representative an authority. We also have the opportunity to take away through accountability. So this is a move then from a traditional focus on political institutions such as party politics, parliaments and election, to streets, squares, schools, news reporting, and social media. And this study of political self-representation by children and youth, I would suggest, open up a new and indeed central landscape of politics that have largely been neglected by political sociologists and political theorists before when it comes to children and youth, since they have routinely been regarded as apolitical or to be citizens. Yet, once this horizon is uncovered, I'm convinced we will also become aware quite a lot of the new empirical and theoretical blind spots on the study on politics for and by children and youth that is in dire need of further exploration. Thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan. Sana? I think you're on mute, Sana.
That's a good idea. Thank you. I will show you a picture because your presentation put me. No. Do you see the no? Sorry, I try this again. Like that.
Yes, we can see that.
Yeah, and well, the presentation puts me right there. And at the square before the Swedish Parliament in August, almost 4 years ago, as I was chair of the Swedish network of refugee support groups, I went to the place just to ask about their ideas and if we could help. And their message was very clear, exactly as you described. We were welcome to support them, but they wanted to decide everything for themselves. Their spokespersons sat down with us to let us share experiences from former sit-ins. And later on, they invited us to some strategy discussions, and we also helped to arrange adult presence at night time. But from the very beginning, we had to promise not to intervene or benefit in any way. And this surprised me because I was used to being presented proudly by refugee groups, especially failed asylum seekers. Listen, this organization support us and they will speak for us. So I was really happy with this new situation. I found it exciting. I had worked for decades with asylum rights in many ways, some years also with the helpline for undocumented children. And I was just fed up with the refugee victim role and the child victim role. It could be harmful, just as Jonathan described. At advice meetings and helpline chats, I mostly hear those who ask for support and advice. They are really victims of violence and ignorance. But I do also hear important witnesses, smart ideas, sound questioning of the migration policy. I can learn from refugee children. But I can't count how many times I have been in a conference room speaking about child rights and child voices with no minors present whatsoever. In the refugee movement, at so many seminars, we talked about letting people with own experience be in focus, etc. But still, the refugee support groups consist of 90% Swedes. We keep to our presumed overview and expert knowledge. And at the same time, many NGOs tend to reach out by presenting the refugee as the innocent child. One explanation for upholding the presentation of victims is that we always have to fight for this against hostile presentations. Over and over, we have to call out to the public and to the politicians. These guys are really refugees. They are vulnerable. They need protection. They are not dangerous intruders coming to rob us and rape us. Refugees have certain rights just because they had to leave everything behind and now they need protection. Children are vulnerable. If they are mistreated, they can't defend themselves. They need adult support, and precisely for this reason, they have certain rights as children. And this can seem obvious, but we in the refugee movement, we are always negotiating this with suspicious migration authorities, and all the more with the xenophobic public. And this dilemma is part of the development that I've seen Jonathan describe about what happened when child rights became mainstream. So this is a question for Jonathan, perhaps. I wonder if you recognize my dilemma and maybe have thoughts about how to handle it. However, I find it interesting that the Young in Sweden organization did not emphasize their rights as children, though many of them were minors. The main demand was not that unaccompanied children need amnesty, even if that point also was in their long list. The main demand was to stop all deportations to Afghanistan. They pictured themselves as competent youth from a misconceived refugee group, not especially vulnerable, but in need of asylum. As I mentioned before, being a refugee can also be a victim role. But my point is that their decision to have an organization of their own was about acting by themselves as youth, not primarily about their needs as minors or young persons. This changed the scene, and they didn't have to argue very much about who they were, if they were over 18 or not, etc., because they focused on the situation in Afghanistan. They never claimed to be children. Then showing their Afghan identity and their ability rather than their vulnerability perhaps also made it easier to target them. In fact, they were soon attacked physically by a nationalist youth group. It's an interesting thought to examine also this group from the view of child or youth representation, but we may leave that for some other researcher. However,
3 minutes left.
3 minutes left, okay. When the next nationalist mob came, announced their arrival, the Afghan youngsters still didn't play out the victim card. But they stayed calm and used a peace and love strategy, which also got thousands of Swedes to stand up before them, between them and the mob, which you can see here. And I think they did many clever choices. And one of the most important was this one, to not underline their vulnerability as minors or appeal only to young ones. After all, if your experiences and demands is what matters, it's not important if you are 16 or 18. But to do this, they had to put aside the expectations of them to be quiet and let adults talk. This can differ. When you look at the Fridays for Future movement, they really must underline their position as children, because this is the heart of their message. We children will inherit this planet, and the climate affects all children. At the same time, they have to keep to the child role while not pointing out any solutions. Don't listen to me, listen to the scientists, Greta Thunberg says. But Young in Sweden never hesitated to suggest solutions. So this is a second question. Have you reflected on pros and cons for child or youth representation to picture themselves as primarily children and stay to child-specific demands, or to use their age just to organize and have a common standpoint from where they fight for whatever cause they find important? If it was exciting to observe the self-confidence of these teenagers, it was even more exciting to see how they moved from one scene to another. They did it to reach new audience, but also to handle the senses of hopelessness during the long strike and the conflicts within the movement on how to proceed. You mentioned that Young in Sweden won a victory with a temporary law on residence permit for certain levels of school attendance. This is also a part of a bigger story of how young refugees have been demonized and made ungrievable. while showing up as young international students can make them tolerated. In the end, a big part of these young ones were forced to leave Sweden and or to stay as undocumented on the streets. Their organization still exists, but as a shadow of its original size. Of course, you can't blame them for the growth of nationalism in Sweden. Given the hostile environment, they still made a remarkably visible protest and stayed in many hearts. And this leads to a last question. A new organization will soon be one of the old organizations. Is it a rule that every new group of children or youngsters must start from scratch? Or can you see any ways for them to survive, include new cohorts, and use each other's experiences without losing their integrity? And there's another way to put my first question. Have you seen any good examples for adults in other organizations to include youth without using them? Thank you.
Thank you, Sanna. So we move on to Professor. Now you wonder why I'm saying Professor Yao Fusukusi, but because I'm from Ghana, and in Ghana, there's no way I could say his first name without having something in front. So he's either uncle or prof. So I'll go with Professor Yao Fusukusi for his presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Afua. And thank you all for participating in our session of the seminar series. My presentation is titled Deliberative Disobedience as a Strategy for Representation by Accra Street Children. And it's based on research that my colleague and I did over a 3-year period in the southwestern part of Accra. Let me begin by saying that Ghana has a youthful population. Now, according to the United Nations Population Fund, the population for 2021 is approximately 32 million. And this is based on an average growth rate of 2.2% for 2015 to 2020 in an average form. When you look at this, 0 to 14-year-olds represent approximately 37%, and 10 to 19-year-olds represent 21.3%. So obviously, more than half of the population of Ghana is below 20 years. I should also add that Ghana is a fairly paternalistic society where considerable authority is vested in adult males. And this quite often gives them representational rights over others, such as children, and even over women in many instances. But their representational abilities are influenced by factors like our family economy, the level of education, their social background, places of residence, among others. But a central trait in children's relational experiences in Ghana is a tradition of respect and obedience to parents. In fact, when you think of more mature children, there's a filial obligation to provide economic support for parents who are old and are unable to fend for themselves, or sometimes they might not be old, but this responsibility still has to be met. So you need to provide healthcare and safety. Safety needs, sociality, and emotional well-being, according to Caro 2014. And all this is usually done in exchange for nurturance, care, and constructive social representation. On this basis, I argue in this presentation that although parents' authority is generally accepted by their children, there is a contemporaneous interrogation of its absoluteness, which is exemplified by a quest for some form of participation in decision-making and a drive for self-representation in some aspects of children's life. Now, street children, who are the subject of our inquiry, are a heterogeneous group shaped by different backgrounds, motivations, and experiences. Their presence on the streets can be traced to a number of factors. Mason and Ofusukusi in 2013, for instance, found that domestic privations, capriciousness of parents, poverty-imposed vulnerabilities, dispossession of childhood entitlements are critical factors that drive many children to the streets. A research by the Department of Social Welfare in Ghana also found that school-related challenges, peer influence or pressure are also critical factors for that. Now, the most reliable census of street children in Accra was done in 2009 by the Department of Social Welfare, Ricerca y Cooperación, and Catholic Action for Street Children, and they came out with a population of 61,492. Considering that this is an old statistic, if we assume that the conditions are the same, the conditions that push children onto the streets have virtually not changed, and if we assume that they are the same, then it can be projected that the population of street children in Accra now will be far higher than this. But there is generally a negative public reaction to the presence of children on the streets. There is sometimes even disbelief by the majority of the public that these children defy their parents, and for that reason, they usually incur the wrath of society for disregarding their parents' authority. They are therefore criticized for the perceived disobedience, disrespectfulness, their recalcitrance, and even pejoratively labeled as kubolo, which is a term for good-for-nothing children, and for which Cowboy in 1997 argues that they are in pursuit of an elusive attraction of the city. We have to think of urban informality when we think of street children as well. And in this respect, we can say that Accra's informal sector is a major attraction to children. And this applies to other major cities of the country. The informal sector is a huge sector, and not just peculiar to Ghana, but something that is quite familiar to most parts of the global South. But it's variously described or defined as activities outside the regulative ambits of the state, according to Harris White 2010, or Hart 2000, Kit Hart 2000 describes it in a much more graphic way when it says it's like the Keynesian mob of petty traders, barbers, repairers, drivers, hawkers, and so on. What is critical is that it enables street children's partial absorption into the economy. And this nature is this very attractiveness to children and even to adults, because usually there's very little or no legal enforcement of labor laws in these places. And for children, they're able to do whatever they want to do because laws about how old one should be before they are formally employed are not enforced here. But what is important to them and to the developing world and to a country like Ghana is that the informal sector represents a crucial and significant sector of Africa's economy. According to African Development Bank 2013, it accounts for 80% of Africa's labor force and contributes 55% of its gross domestic product. So obviously, its importance in the lives of children who want to find some amount of independence is quite important, quite critical, I should say. But we must also think of representation, which is the key thing in our endeavor at this stage. And in this sense, I want to note that representation for my presentation is not conceptualized in the traditional democratic sense, where officials are granted the power to represent as a result of an election that has taken place. And for that reason, they become accountable to the electors. Rather, I'm thinking of representation or treating it as a practical exercise of moral authority over others because of how they are socially positioned. In this sense, there's no formal empowerment as in political representation, but actions are legitimized by social norms and traditions. It is seen as, if I may borrow from Horst Schweiter 2016, performative acts of representation on others through social and discursive practices. But my concern here is how parents as actors exercise this influence or power over their children, and how children's actions may contest that influence of power over them. Going back to Holzweiser, she says that representation, and I quote, is a form of power. It encompasses the possibility and authority to express, defend, and advocate for others without their immediate involvement or control. In this context, children's representation in Ghana is occasioned by others, actualized through the effort or even generosity of adults, because they lack the right to choose who they want to represent them, or they do not have the wherewithal to control them when they are chosen. There is an obvious challenge of ambivalence here. If representation is power or authority over others, such that someone stands in place of another, then whose rights or interests do parents or adults generally truly advocate? But of course, parents have a natural right of representation and duty of care for their children. But sometimes this is marred by toxic socialization and the power imbalances that would position the adult or the parent at a much higher level, and for that reason, give that adult the authority to enforce rules and regulations or socialization practices that may not be in the interest of the child. The Convention of the Rights of the Child is of considerable benefit when children's representation or self-representation is being interrogated. When we think of Article 12, for instance, children are supposed to be given the right to express their views freely. And not only that, we are expected to listen to them, whatever opinions or views they have, if they are capable of forming opinions. But if you think of representation in Ghana in this sense, what you find out that it's not very easy to have this applied at all in many families, especially poor and urban households that are blighted by structural inequalities, unstable income, as well as unstable sources of income. But the middle class, the highly educated, that group might easily understand the idea behind the convention and probably would be much more interested in implementing Article 12, for instance. But in this, there is an ubiquitous challenge to some parents' representational rights. And this is the exploitation of children's utilitarian value for economic gains. This obviously compromises the parents' level of consultation with the child, as well as impairs adults' representation of children's interests, especially when they instigate premature assumption of adult roles for economic returns. This creates a tendency for some children to leverage that potential to chip off some of the parents' authority and to bolster their self-representation. In effect, it emboldens children to claim some control over their lives. Now, the background to my discussion here, as I said earlier, is based on a 3-year qualitative research in markets, lorry stations, informal settlements.
You have 3 minutes left.
3 minutes. Okay. The research sought to understand children's street life as labor, relational challenges with their family, and how they reconcile those challenges with their interests. There were 102 participants aged between 8 and 7, and we engaged in a dialogue with a purpose with them. In doing this, we considered them socially capable beings or arbiters of their own experience. What we found is that inadequacies and vulnerabilities are propellants for children to seek alternative forms of representation. Staying put in the house, for instance, confirms reverence and respectfulness towards parents, but migrating to Accra confirms deliberative defiance or disobedience and represents an embodied resistance to familial authority. This embodied resistance is manifested in assertiveness, increased awareness of their potential for making decisions, and realization of economic potential outside the domestic domain. If we take One of our participants, for instance, Peitu, she says, I didn't inform my parents before coming because they wouldn't have let me. Sometimes we do things that we should do, but we do them anyway, because sometimes we have to do things for ourselves. There are others, but for lack of time, I will just go on. We discern deliberation over decision to migrate. We discern an acknowledgement of a disregard to their parents. Nonetheless, they persisted in their actions for personal space, personal capacity, and elevation of their agency. We further discern conflict between self-interest and parental authority as evidenced in their defense, which could lead to destabilization of the parent-child relationship, as well as emergence of familial tension when they try to assert such rights. This, according to Larkins, could be thought of as acts of citizenship that results in shifts in rights and responsibilities, and in fact, the creation of new actors who are claimants of their rights and responsibilities. However, the children concede their parents' social and moral responsibilities in their life. We see no repudiation of the authority or their influence over them, but there is still a resultant deliberative disobedience because of the distance separating them from their parents, because of the earning power they get when in Accra, because of a perceived incapacitation of parents, and because of a pursuit of their own goals, expectations, and interests. But they are also challenged by contradictory expectations. They are in Accra, they want to make money, but at the same time, they have to take into consideration what their parents are saying. But while such direct refusals connote a contestation of their parental authority, it also denotes a mobilization of their personal abilities, what Myers called children's protagonism. In conclusion, part of our study shows that there are instances of defiance and disobedience when children decide to migrate to the cities, but usually it's because they want to claw back some of the rights of representation for themselves. But it doesn't reflect an open contestation of the status quo. And so there is no opposition of what folks 2019 called the moral master frame. Rather, there's a restructuring of the frame to bolster children's agency in the family or society. The actions are therefore both direct and nuanced liberation from the structures of parental control, dysfunctional families, challenged schooling systems, and so on and so forth. But it has the effect of simultaneously igniting self-representation while diminishing representational claims of parents. Thank you, Afua, and all of you. Good.
Thank you very much. Now, unfortunately, Prof's discussant hasn't been able to join us. So what is going to happen is that I will provide a brief response, and I'll be joined by another member from our project team, Carl Hansen. So we will make a brief comment. I will go first, if that's all right, Carl. And basically, I just want to say that I was really struck by the notion of reciprocity that came out very strongly in your paper. And one of the things about reciprocity is, or how it's talked about, is how I guess you issue a contract to somebody and you're both supposed to fulfill certain parts of that contract in order for it to work. And a lot of the literature talks about the obligations that come with reciprocal, I can't say the word, with the value of reciprocity. However, what your paper shows is what happens when one party doesn't fulfill their part of the obligation really well. Because I think one of the things you talk about quite a bit is how the parents, as a result of the poverty that they're experiencing, most of them are in the north of Ghana, I believe, are not fulfilling their what the children perceive as their responsibilities. And therefore, the children see that as an opportunity to follow their individualized interest, which is to go to Accra and make some money and take care of themselves. So it's really interesting how you show what happens when, as a result of a value placed on reciprocity, but when one part or one party does not fulfill their obligations. I was also really struck in your paper by the clear and very strong individualism that came through in the children's statements about not wanting to go back home, even though their parents are trying to get them back home, etc. And it'd be really interesting to hear a bit more about that and the implications of this strong individualism for values that have long been transmitted in Ghana between parents and children. At the same time, even though the children are trying to do what they want to do and take care of their own interests, it also came through that they still want to foster a good relationship with their families. So they send money back home, they keep in touch, but they're not doing what their parents want, which is to come back home. So you see how that notion of communalism and kinship remains important to them, even when they're trying to, or when they're being defiant, when they're being disobedient, which is very interesting given the extent to which respect and obedience remains critical to parent-child relationships in Ghana today. Carl, would you like to add something?
Yeah, well, thanks, Afua. Yeah, and Yao also. I have a picture behind me that we took when we were in this project. We also went to Ghana, and I would like to thank you again, Yao, but then also Afua for your hospitality then. And I would say I take the opportunity first, Afua, to thank you for being such a great organizer and project leader all the way. Because I do think with Yao's presentation, one of the things that we had with working on children's representation was, I think it was something that Rudy told before. He spoke about language. So you're using children's representation in a discussion on child poverty in an industrialized country. And then we move on. We use children's representation also on stakes where, well, the North and the South meet in the example of Jonathan's space and with Sana's comments on the political representation of young people and migrants in Sweden. And now we go with Yao. And I think that's the great thing of this the project and of the ambitions we had, is to try to bring these things together and also go back to, well, the ethnographic work Yao has been doing and the fascinating work he has been doing in looking at perspectives from the street children in Accra and their stakes with representation. And just very brief, what I take from Yao's input is how important it is to, well, I would say to do both at the same time, to look at the same time at how these kinship relationships and how they play out, and how long-standing ways of familial relationships, how they work out, and how representations, self-representations, representations of parents of their children and vice versa, and how they continue to play out. And at the same time, Yao, you just also mentioned suddenly, well, I would say suddenly, but there is Article 12 of the CRC. So you can't just say that is not real. It is there somewhere also. And I think, well, I liked in Yao's paper and work a lot this whole thing of navigating how people make a sense out of it, how they try to be, well, young people fight for their autonomy, and at the same time they still are trying to stick to what ties them to their past and to their families, and how this is a very complex web of things that are happening. I'm not sure if we succeeded as a collective, that saying that children's representation is now the new thing, but at least coming back to what was said before, this idea of working in that language around children's representation and the many things it has to offer, like we were discussing also the representation, just the images we have of children as representation, but also, and I think Yao adds this idea of how representation is also about authority and is also looking for power. Is it giving power to someone else to be represented by someone else? Is it taking power from someone else? what about self-representation? How far does that go? So I think all these are very fascinating. I think, well, again, thanks, Jo, for I would say with bringing the empirical very close to the young people's perspectives into it shows the relevance also, I think, of our work. So Afua, that's maybe some of the thoughts I could give, and we can hopefully have also further conversation with everybody who's there.
Thank you very much. So I just want to say thank you to all the presenters and the discussants, and those of you who were here last week, and you'll see how Didier Reynaert's paper really followed on quite nicely from the ones that we had last week, which largely focused on how different adult actors make claims relating to representing children. And his paper, oh, sorry, I can hear some background noise. And his paper really well shows the extent to which the children's rights movement, with its focus on children as individuals in particular, have led to a situation whereby children living in poverty are seen as quite separate units and treated quite separately from children from their parents in their own families. And in this way, Didier really problematized the children's rights framework, which is dominant in many discussions around child poverty. Now, the other two papers that followed, I saw really strong synergies between the two in discussions of migrant children in Sweden and street children in Ghana. And it was interesting how they talked about the ways children themselves seek to represent themselves in both the micro and the macro sphere in the different contexts, breaking links with previous ways of doing things, whether that was in the family or in kinship relations more generally, or in terms of how migrant issues, especially relating to unaccompanied migrants, have been represented in Sweden before. And in Ghana, the reasons that the children were seeking to take these actions was because of the context of poverty that their families were living in. And in Sweden, this was due to the inefficiencies that the young people saw were attached to rather large organizations, and which was critical at a time when there'd been a shift in government immigration policies, leading to a more conservative stance on immigration. So thank you all very much for your papers. Before we move to broader discussions, it would be good for each of the presenters to just very quickly, 1 minute each, to respond to the issues raised by the discussants in their presentation. So Didier, can we start with you, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. And thank you very much also, Rudy, for your reflections on my paper. I would just, you raised a lot of different issues, and I want to take out just one that really triggered me somehow, and at the same time, which is quite beautiful in the way you put it. In your slides, you mentioned somewhere at the end to embrace the tension between children's rights and human rights, and I think you could even broaden it and to embrace the tension between children and parents. And I think that is exactly at stake here in the issue of child poverty, because maybe my position can be understood wrongly if someone would say that, well, Didier, you are going back in time with your plea that you are making to leave the focus on the child and go back to the family. And that's not what I wanted to say. I think what Rudy was stating, to embrace the tension between children's rights and human rights, or to embrace the tension between children and parents, exactly that is at stake here, I think, in the issues of child poverty. And that is extremely difficult, because you mentioned the case of foster care. I think it's a very good example to think about what we can do if you know that foster carers are taking care of children, and you know that these children come from families living in poverty. What is then your task as a foster carer in relation to these issues of poverty? That's a very difficult issue. It reminds me on other practices that are in place to combat child poverty in Flanders. For instance, in several cities, local networks were set up to combat child poverty. And if you look at these local networks and look at who's around the table, then you see all these actors, these NGOs, these representatives coming from children's rights organizations. And that's good. Again, I think organizations who are supporting children, like schools or sporting clubs and so on, these are very necessary in combating child poverty. But what was missing around the table were representatives from the housing company, representatives who support families or parents to get a job on the labor market. They were not around the table, and exactly that is at stake here. How can we also involve them in issues to combat child poverty? And so what you were saying, really, to embrace the tension between children's rights and human rights, exactly that is at stake, and that still needs, I think, more insight in the way we can do that, and how we can support also professionals in doing that. So thank you.
Thank you, Didier. And Jonathan.
And yeah, thank you, Sanna, for these very thoroughly and well thought reflections, and they're stimulating a lot of different associations of mine. So I just respond to some of them, and I also think they connect actually to some of both Didier's and Jarl's presentation about some of the paradoxes actually of the children's rights here, and I think that also speaks to how what Carl mentioned, like the opportunity to conceptualize and discuss around representation. I think it helps a little bit and liberate ourselves a little bit from this and makes us see things. So you have had 3 questions as I noticed, and I think they can be responded. The first 2 of them I think actually could responded together a little bit. I mean, what you speak to is this kind of what to do with this kind of victimhood, vulnerability that is supposed to refugees and also children. And it is truly a kind of paradox. And I think it speaks both to the migration regime more generally, namely that we have a structure and organization and global governance on migration that, if we speak with Didier Fassin's, for example, terms about, it is organized around what he refers to as humanitarian reasons, which is basically saying that, okay, in order to get a protection, in order to be able to migrate, have to somehow fit into this regime of, humanitarianism. So that is the pathway to move, pathway to get accepted or the right to stay, which makes it difficult. And this is particularly strong for children then. I mean, you have these specific child provisions in legislations around the world as a consequence of the implementation and spread of UNCRC, I would say, and also national developments. But what you show also and reflected on, Sanna, which is very important here, I think, it is that young in Sweden, they were, for sure, a lot of them were minors. Not all of them, perhaps, but they were in this real adolescence in between. But they didn't stress this kind of childity or child specificness, but rather they emphasize something else, and they emphasize an agency, which is also a danger, of course, because then you would not fit into these protection provisions and humanitarian reasons protections. So instead, they tried something else. They tried to make politics and they tried to emphasize their agency, which is a risk then in order to get protection, as we have seen research demonstrating. But there is also, of course, a pathway, I guess, for emancipation that they saw. They noticed this. This seemed to be an effective strategy, or at least we need it. We cannot just watch, being passive to this kind of domination as they reflect upon it. We have to do something and liberate. In order to emancipate, you have to liberate from others and so on. And then they make use of this. And I think also to speak to your latest points about new organizations and old ones for youth, and also in terms of childity or emphasizing more likeliness to adulthood. So we see this, I mean, we have a lot of old youth and child youth organizations, but in some instances, I think there new groups have a need to liberate also from these old institutionalized youth organizations in order to be able to act more independently and efficiently. And I think there is a complement of both. There is a pros and cons of both being, this kind of old institutionalized youth movement or organization, or being a new movement with new energy and so on. And just lastly, this about comparison with the climate, I think it's a very nice and important reflection of yours, that they have stressed this childity the specificness of childhood as particularly vulnerable, we should not be here, Greta says in a speak in New York. Why I should not be here, I should be back in school, while instead the young migrants here from Afghanistan, yeah, they are in school, they want to be good citizens in schools, but they are also at the same time saying, hey, we are here, we are not vulnerable, we are very active, and we want to participate and contribute in the society and so on, much more active agency approach. So just a short reflection, but thanks.
Thank you. And Prof, just briefly, maybe a quick response to what Carl and I said. You're on mute, you're on mute.
Yeah, a big thanks to you and Carl for stepping in the last minute. I appreciate that. But I think I will take a point out of your discussion of what I've said, and this is the issue of reciprocity. Obviously, a central part of lives in almost every part of Ghana is how people reciprocate what they get from others. And it underlines the coexistence where we do things in the expectation that when we also are in a similar situation, we will have someone come to our aid. And this is quite consistent with developing countries, or with a developing country like ours, where you don't always have the certainty of incomes or employment and so on. And so we use sociality as a form of insurance against the unknown. And obviously, reciprocity is so central to families that sometimes it pushes people into quite some amount of altruism, doing things not necessarily with the expectation of getting things. But this is the way people see family is about, especially when one thinks of the extended family. In this respect, it is always assured that one will never, if I may use Liverpool's motto, whatever team it is, I think Liverpool, one may never walk alone, But obviously, there's been a deepening of structural inequalities. Unemployment has been rising, instabilities in people's incomes, and so on. And the more this happens, the more this emphasizes the importance of reciprocity, except that the deepening of structural inequalities is a key aspect of neoliberalism that Ghana religiously implemented in the early 2000s and the late 1990s. And a huge outcome of that became individualism, which of course is a tenet of neoliberal policies. The fact that one shouldn't depend on government, and that we should look after things for ourselves, and that government is going to be reduced to the barest minimum so that we take responsibility for ourselves, care of the market. This might work very, very well in economies where the markets and other forms of means of production and distribution are fairly organized. But in our situations where they are not always the case, unemployment is very, very high. This becomes a challenge. And so obviously, this deepened structural inequalities. Velet, writing in 2000 on neoliberalism in Ghana, said that it turned men into women because in Ghana, mostly men are the ones that are placed forward when it comes to provision for the family. Although obviously women play very, very critical roles in how this is done. But the key thing is that when people are saddled with responsibilities that they have no ways of solving them, then they begin to develop selfish tendencies. And this contrasts with the reciprocity and extended family and altruism and the idea of doing things for people, so that when the turn comes, people forget this and tend to look after themselves because they are challenged and because they may not have the wherewithal to do things for other people. And so we have this situation where reciprocity as an important part of our social system is gradually being eroded. and more people are seeing themselves as individuals in the market and production place. Dependency in the form of one taking or assuming responsibility for people who are not necessarily part of their nuclear family is something that increasingly are on the lips of people. But this is something that people took for granted in the past. So I think as a central aspect of our lives, reciprocity is being undermined, although people recognize this. And to cap, my point, it's understandable from the perspective of children as well, that in the past they would have said, okay, my parents are going to find whatever means to do to look after me, to put me in school if I have to, and so on. But it's not always the case. This is why sometimes they assume responsibilities that previously would have been reserved for parents, so that they can do things for themselves. But in doing that, it reinforces the idea of the individual rather than the centrality of family and reciprocity in Ghanaian social systems. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you to all participants. Thank you to the presenters, and thank you to the discussants. We appreciate you so much for giving us your time. We're now going to stop the recording, and then we're going to open the floor to discussions. So